from Ralph. What do you think, do you think that a better definition of a way to look at health in terms of obesity would also sort of help motivate people to be more proactive in actually getting healthy? Because I think a weakness sometimes of the BMI seems to be that not only do doctors not take it with absolute seriousness, but I think that is leaked into the public too, where it's this is a number that I'm kind of unhealthy, but it's a bad number anyway, so why worry about it too much? Because I think that obviously there's studies that show there's correlations with health issues if you have a BMI in a certain range, but it doesn't seem like the obesity rates have dropped very much, even though people know that they're in these unhealthy categories now.
So one of the things that's really interesting about how BMI is used in these studies, and particularly with clinical researchers that are also practicing physicians. And so when they are meeting with a patient for the first time, and weight may or may not be an issue that they have to talk about, they may take those measurements, or they may not. And what determines whether they take those measurements, as many of them have conveyed to me, is the eyeball test. And so if the eyeball test, which is essentially just looking at someone and determining whether you think BMI might be something that's meaningful for them, is more indicative of how you're going to think about that particular patient's health, then it sort of echoes that BMI really has no use at the individual level. And that is something that is echoed by a lot of researchers, that BMI is something that is very powerful at the population level, but at the individual level, oftentimes it's not a very useful indicator for people. But what's interesting now, taking kind of that discussion or that sort of debate and layering it on top of new research that's coming out, is that there are specific categories of obese people and non-obese people. So you have metabolically healthy obese people, which are those that may fall into an overweight or mildly obese category as per their BMI, but are metabolically healthy. And so their cholesterol levels, their sugar levels, their cardiovascular kind of health is all okay. And so what becomes interesting about those studies is that I then ask researchers, well then why is their weight still a problem? And so the answer there is that whole time. So most of the studies that have been done with metabolically healthy obese people maybe span 3 years, but a long time, or the level at which they think their obesity will then become problematic in terms of their health, would be 10 years. And so it doesn't actually ask, or it doesn't kind of make those researchers question whether that person's obesity is or is not a problem. It then becomes, well, they just haven't been obese long enough for it to weigh down the body, if that sort of makes sense. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Does that have there been longevity studies on something of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, the longest studies have been 3 to 5 years, and so that's the biggest problem. So within obesity research communities, there's a debate right now about whether being mildly obese is or is not a problem. And this is known as the obesity paradox, whether mild rates of obesity are actually problematic, or if for some people, being slightly overweight, again, using BMI, I'm very hesitant to use the word as actually saying overweight, is problematic or not for them. And so there are people in the research community that don't believe that it is, and they're trying to say for some people it's actually healthier to be at a higher weight. But then there are other people saying, no, it's not. It's just that they haven't been overweight long enough in order for it to take a toll on the body. And then if you followed up with those patients, and these have been thousands of participants in these studies. These are not small studies. That if you waited a long enough period of time, their obesity would become a problem. And I've talked with researchers who have specifically said, I can't ever imagine myself telling someone it would be healthy for them to lose weight. But what's the problem about not ever being able to imagine that is that it kind of restricts the type of study you can do, or how you can really conceptualize what health is. And that's one of the major arguments I'm making.
Just to clarify, you're saying that there's only been studies that have been 3 years, and they haven't checked to say that someone's classified as overweight for a long time.
So
there hasn't been the follow-up?
Discussions about metabolically healthy obese and metabolically unhealthy non-obese probably started around 2009, 2010, when that became something really popular to talk about. And so follow-up studies that have been designed have not been longer than a 3 to 5 year period. That's something that people are talking about now, with a pushback against that, is that there's no hard evidence that perhaps it's not problematic.
Okay.
I have a question for Paul. Well, I do really appreciate the historical aspect of your project, history of languages, history of your meetings. I kind of struggle with two notions. One being that if it's not in English, it doesn't exist. So, and I maybe not understand, you know, we need clarification. And two being that we inherently categorize.
Well, it not being in English so it doesn't exist that's really confined to what we call published science, because there has been such an explosion in the number of column inches published in all fields of natural science in the last 30 years, and the digital revolution has been largely responsible for that. Many people in medicine and natural science now say, if it's not in English, I'm not going to read it because I don't have time. It's hard enough to keep up with what people are writing in English. There is a hegemony of English in the scientific world. That's partly a historical artifact. It's partly to do with the arising of the concept of objectivity in Victorian science, which is based in England. But in a broader sense, there are fungible languages, there are alphabetical languages. So an English person can learn to read Russian fairly quickly. An English person can learn to read German and French fairly quickly, but it's much harder to read Chinese or Japanese, and particularly to understand the underlying concepts, because it's not just a case of passing one grammar into another. Chinese and Japanese are actually based on quite different epistemological concepts than European languages, which is what gives them their value in science and makes it worthwhile actually going the extra mile to try and unearth and understand and appreciate those approaches. And just talking about something like BMI, for example, if you think about the philosophical underpinnings of Western medicine compared to, for example, Chinese or other Asian medical paradigms, the notion of health and the notion of holism have very, very different baselines and very, very different methodologies in those cultures. But we know only what is passed into our own languages from that, unless we make the effort to go in and mine it ourselves, which requires an investment of many, many years of work. The other thing about the point about the inherent human propensity to classify, well, there is massive and overwhelming evidence for this, because all of what we would take as the hallmarks of human culture, from cave paintings to cunic clay blocks, all the way up to computers, all have to do with the naming of classified entities. That is something that is that and is not that. And that whole fixing of objects out of the landscape so that you can relay their meaning when they are no longer present. If you come back to the cave and you say, I saw a bear down in the woods, let's go and get it, you presume that everyone else you're talking to knows what bear means, also knows what woods means, and then knows what let's go get him implies, which is, you young guys go get him and I'll cheer you on and I'll hold you coat. So the whole fundamental mechanism of language is about classification. It has no other use. It's only about saying, if I have this picture in my mind, I want to take one big element out of that picture, put a name on it, and give it to you, so that you can then align it with the same thing in your picture, and we're both on the same page. We both know what we're talking about. So if I say to you, I want to marry your daughter, I don't have to explain to you who your daughter is. So,
I think it's 1 o'clock. Sandra, do you keep it tight?
We do. If there's a couple more questions, whoever has time to stay is certainly welcome to do so. Otherwise, don't feel bad.
Go ahead.
I just have a question for Mel. You talk about this debate that's going on where some people say that you can be a little overweight and still be healthy, and the other side is saying that, well, they just haven't been overweight for long enough to have it have an effect. How do you differentiate once these overweight people start having health problems? How do you definitively say that it's because they've been overweight for this duration as opposed to maybe extenuating health circumstances from their age or other factors?
Well, you don't. Which I think is one of the biggest problems with that. But that speaks to a larger problem that I also critique as, obesity essentially is considered a risk factor, which is why it's complicated that now it has a label of a disease for several other health conditions. But because a lot of those studies have been epidemiological studies, and even those CDC maps that I showed up were self-reported studies, there's not really controlled studies that look at obesity over time without thinking about other lifestyle, parts of it. And so, I mean, some of the biggest studies that have been done that were not specifically about obesity but have now been looked at for obesity are the nurses study and the Framingham study. So these were like very, very large cohort studies that followed. One was a cohort of nurses over a very long period of time. The other was a group in, I think it was Massachusetts. But obesity has been constructed as a sort of a lifestyle problem. And things that contribute to obesity have been shown to be, diet, exercise, perhaps epigenetic factors, all of these different things, but they all occur simultaneously. And in what, aside from in rats, which now a lot of obesity studies have been done, even those rats have perfect obesity because it's been genetically modified. And so it doesn't actually mirror what the human has. And so you can't really tease that out as it is. But the popular assumption is to blame it on obesity. And my question is why that happens, and that's something that I'm exploring as well.
Any other questions? Thanks everyone for coming, and if you have more questions, feel free to talk to our speakers. And
If you could just please toss your trash and recycling on your way out, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much. Hey, thank you.